Good morning. I'm Raleigh Flynn, the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and this morning we're going to be discussing a very important topic. Aaron Stein, our Middle East Program Director, who's also our Director of Research and our Acting Director of National Security Program, will be moderating a discussion with Josh Krasner, who's a senior fellow in our Middle East program, and I can't think of anyone better to talk about this very complicated topic. Before I turn it over to Aaron, I'd just quickly like to thank our members and our supporters, and if you are not in that category, ask you to please consider becoming a member or a donor to FPRI. You'll see this morning, we do the story behind the story. We don't gloss over things the way the media does. So if you appreciate that, please consider supporting us. Put your questions in the Q&A box. We'll be going to those about halfway through the program. Also, we'll have a map of the region in the chat box. So without further ado, let me hand over the reins to Aaron Stein.
Thanks, Raleigh, and thanks everybody for joining us virtually. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Joshua Krasner, who for many FPRI members is no stranger. I believe Josh was, I think the last time we saw you, we were talking about this was in person, obviously before the pandemic, and we hope that this upcoming fall or winter or perhaps spring, you can once again join us in our offices and give a live in-person briefing. Well, Josh is beyond just being a nice person, is an analyst specializing in the Middle East political and regional developments and forecasting, as well as in international strategic issues. He retired in 2017 after 30 years of service in Israel, to include postings as an Israeli diplomat in Jordan and Canada. His last assignment before retirement was as an instructor at the Israel National Defense College. He has published numerous articles and is proficient in Arabic and Hebrew. He has a PhD from Bar-Ilan University and is a graduate of Columbia University and the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. He also teaches at NYU, which we were talking about off camera or off webinar before the program started. So with that, Josh, what we're going to be doing is you will be speaking for about 20 to 30 minutes. During that time, I encourage everybody to think about questions and use the Q&A function at the bottom. We should all be pretty familiar with that. And pose them, and I will be moderating that virtual Q&A at the bottom half of the hour. If that Q&A doesn't work for you for some reason, you can always type them into the chat box, and I will do my best to go through that as well. So without further ado, Josh, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks, Aaron, and thanks, Raleigh, for giving me this opportunity. So what I'd like to do, we're sort of in the middle of the event. In fact, a few minutes ago, my wife asked what happens if we get a missile siren during the event, and I said I'll continue because this is more important. We have had one every day in our house since the issue has begun. And what I'd like to do for the next half hour or so is, as Raleigh pointed out. Part of our job here is to make the simple complex and the complex simple. So what I'm going to lay out to you is the context in which this crisis unfolds, which I think is very important to understand. I'm not going back to 1948, but I'll go back to a few weeks before the issue came up. And then a couple of observations on how the crisis is unfolding, and then maybe one or two observations on where it could go from here, and hopefully that will both give you some good insights and enable you to ask some questions afterwards. There's some issues I'm going to touch on less, and those certainly, if you want me to expand on them, you can in your Q&A. And I would start even just before I study the context, just sort of think all the time that there is one conflict here, but it's actually three distinct sub-conflicts going on at the same time. One is a conflict or a crisis in Jerusalem, and one is the exchange of fire between Israel and Gaza, and the third, and as we'll discuss later, perhaps the most worrying, for me as an Israeli and for most Israelis is the civil unrest within Israel. And I'll try to touch on all three of those, but it's important to see this all as a whole, but it's also important to see it as three distinct sub-conflicts and how they relate to each other. So first, we'll talk about what was the context in which this unfolded. And a lot of people have spoken about how this was sort of a perfect storm. And it was, because a lot of things came together at the same time to cause something which was bad enough to become something much worse. One interesting question, which I'm going to throw out, and which maybe if somebody wants to bring up later, is whether there was an intelligence surprise here. I'm not exactly sure it's an intelligence surprise, but I think it certainly, no one predicted how it would develop. And part of that is because, as I'll discuss in a minute, of the nature of how it developed. So the first was just an issue of, let's say, bad timing. I always said that apparently no one looked at a calendar at the end of April and said, we're going to have a problem the next 2 weeks. And the reason for that, of course, is because we had basically the holiest day of the holiest week of the Muslim year, which includes Laylatul Qadr, and then a week later includes Eid al-Fitr, which fell out at the same time as Jerusalem Day, which is a national holiday which is observed in Israel since 1967 to celebrate the reunification of the two parts of Jerusalem. First, the Eastern Jerusalem being occupied between 1948 and 1967 by Jordan. And that is a national holiday. And one of the things people do on that holiday is they go to Jerusalem. In other words, so Jewish Israelis from all over the country, every Jerusalem day, go to Jerusalem and walk around, especially through East Jerusalem. We'll discuss that in a minute. And at the same time, in this week, you have hundreds of thousands of Muslim citizens of Israel and Muslim inhabitants of Jerusalem who want to go up to the Temple Mount. And remember, for those of you who don't know, the old city is a very small kind of cockpit where this all comes together. So first you have that. And then you have, you have to remember that for since the beginning of the month of Ramadan, which was almost exactly a month ago, we've been having steadily escalating problems in Jerusalem. We have what we call the TikTok attacks, which were attacks by Arab youths on usually ultra-Orthodox pedestrians, which they filmed on TikTok and put up to the web. And then you had a reaction by radical nationalist Jewish teens against Arab passerbys as well. And this all began even before the crisis began to unfold in Sheikh Jarrah. And then you have Sheikh Jarrah, which also at the exact same time, right? Sheikh Jarrah, I'm not going to go into too much detail about it. I'll just say that a neighborhood which the ownership of the houses there is conflicted, and an Israeli court decided that Palestinian families who had moved in to abandoned Jewish homes in 1948 had to leave those houses. And a court found about the week before these issues started to get very explosive, a court found that that the evictions were legal and that the people had to leave the houses. And the police or the owners and the police decided that that the eviction notice needed to be carried out immediately. So you have all of that sort of pulling us into Jerusalem. And of course, Jerusalem, as we know, and over the past 20 years, certainly, almost all of the significant unrest since the Second Intifada, of course, before the Second Intifada, 1996, 2000, the Second Intifada started, there are claims that it started because Arik Sharon went up on the Temple Mount, which is holy, of course, to both Jews and Arabs, but which is right now open almost solely to Muslims and under the control of the Muslim custodianship of the holy sites, which is run by Jordan under our peace treaty. So Al-Aqsa, since 1996, this is before 1996, has become very often sort of the starter that starts both local in Jerusalem, but wider as well, and regional conflagrations, because Al-Aqsa and the Temple Mount has a resonance which is not only among Arab inhabitants of Jerusalem and not only of Muslim inhabitants of Israel and the territories, but in fact Muslims all over the world. And the significance of Al-Aqsa and the significance to what is perceived as threats to Al-Aqsa is something that unifies Muslims all over the world. So the issue starts in Jerusalem, right? We begin to have this unrest in Jerusalem, and this unrest is inflamed or is accelerated by political developments both on the Israeli and the Palestinian side. So on the Israeli side, we had our fourth elections in 2 years. The last time Aaron and I spoke at FPRI was after the last elections. So we had our fourth elections, and those elections, in fact, the result of those elections was the first real chance of Benjamin Netanyahu, who's been prime minister since 2009, actually leaving office, right? But the problem with that, of course, so you had a real breakthrough in that anti-Netanyahu parties were able to perhaps reach a majority in the Knesset. The reason I say perhaps is the anti-Netanyahu camp is extremely diverse. It includes people who are on the right, who are on the strong right and right center, who don't like Netanyahu, so they're willing to join others who don't agree with them politically in order to get rid of Netanyahu. It includes the center left, and it includes Arab two parties that represent the Arab citizens of Israel. And the reason why I stress two parties is we have a break here. In the past few elections, you had a united Arab Arab list which ran together, and in the most recent elections, Mansour Abbas, who is the head of an organization called Ra'am, which is the Muslim Islamist party in Israel, legal Muslim Islamist party, split off. And the reason that he split off is he is a person who is saying the Palestinian issue is very important to us, but the more important issues are issues that are important to us as Arab citizens of Israel, crime, discrimination, which I want to deal with. And then once he made it over the electoral threshold, he has 5 seats. Then you had this very interesting development, which is that neither side, neither Netanyahu nor the anti-Netanyahu camp, could reach a majority in the Knesset without having at least one Arab party join their coalition. And then you had a very unusual situation in which Netanyahu and his allies in Likud were willing to accept Mansour Abbas as part of their governing coalition. The first time a right-wing government in Israel has been willing to entertain the ideas of an Arab party joining the coalition, but more than that, the first time in Israeli politics that there was a real chance that an Arab party was going to join the coalition. And the reason for this, of course, was that Mansour Abbas specifically was the tiebreaker between all of the anti-Netanyahu camp had not more than 60 seats, depending on how it's counted, 58 seats. The Netanyahu camp had a maximum of 58 seats, and therefore the only person, the party that could make the difference was Mansour Abbas. So suddenly you had a situation where for the first time there was an Arab kingmaker in Israeli politics and an excellent chance that a government would actually be formed, either with the support of support from outside the coalition of Arab parties, but Mansour Abbas actually wanted to be a member of the coalition. So you have that. And what that led to, of course, is that you have a government in Israel, an interim government, which is two-headed, because remember the last election, Netanyahu formed a government with Benny Gantz's blue and white party. So it's a two-headed, paralyzed, lame duck government, right? Which has not been able to make any real decisions since the elections, because his chief partner, blue and white, has said that he will not serve under him in the next in the next government. So the government today is composed basically of two major parties, which are not going to go together once the interim government is gone. So the government was basically shut down. And what ended up happening, a lot of decisions weren't being made, but what ended up happening was very much the management of the problems in Jerusalem was left to the police, right? in the absence of government, the police sort of, because they have to protect public order, they were the ones who were in charge. And the police are headed under an inexperienced and not very politically savvy new commissioner, who was appointed by Netanyahu and by Netanyahu's police minister, public safety minister, because they thought he would be a weak figure. Because remember that there are police investigations and a court case going on against Netanyahu. So what that meant was that the government was basically paralyzed, and that any decisions that were being made at the level of by the forces on the ground or by the government at the latest possible moment. So therefore, when things started deteriorating strongly in Jerusalem, because of perhaps a heavy-fisted strategy by the police, the government did not get involved until the last day, right? The day before, on Jerusalem Day, tens of thousands of right-wing Jewish demonstrators were planning to enter the Old City, walk through the Muslim quarter, and go up to the Temple Mount. And that was canceled 2 hours before it was supposed to happen. Even though, as I said, everybody knew a month before that it was supposed to be happening. Everybody knew a month before that this was the Muslim Holy Week. Now, that's also important because this governmental crisis has also both threatened and empowered the far right in Israel. The far right in Israel is basically supporting the Netanyahu government. The Netanyahu government allowed the most right-wing, or Netanyahu basically convinced one of the other parties to allow the most right-wing figures in Israel to join that party. And in their view, the alternative government, which was taking shape, the government which was going to be composed of right-wing, anti-Bibi, left and center, and Arabs, was sort of the end of the Zionist dream for them. It was the worst possible outcome that can happen. Therefore, I think a lot of what was going on in Jerusalem was on the ground with sort of these extreme right-wingers expressing their unhappiness with the results of the election and with the possibility with the government that was possible that it was going to be formed. So just to point out, when we're talking about the right wing, we're talking about Israel has a right wing majority. However, as I said, because some of the parties in the right will have promised they will not sit in the government with Netanyahu, then while there is a right-wing majority, that right-wing majority is not translated into a majority for Bibi. Now, there's a question that gets asked, and I'm going to answer it now the best I can. A lot of people in the United States, certainly a lot of people who are against Israeli policy, say that this was all, but also a lot of Israelis who hate Netanyahu see this all as sort of a Machiavellian plan, a strategy by Netanyahu, that he caused everything to get much worse in order to preserve his hold on power. Because two things: the day after Jerusalem Day, the day after the terrible riots on the Temple Mount in Al-Aqsa, which, by the way, from the beginning of the events until the 10th of May, no one was killed in them. Right? There were very violent demonstrations. The police went into the mosque and everything else, but no one was killed in those 2 weeks of unrest in Jerusalem. So there are those who say that it was all planned by Netanyahu because, in fact, once that began, and as we'll discuss, once Hamas got involved, the alternative government fell apart. And in fact, at this moment, there is no alternative government to Netanyahu's government, which means we'll probably be going to elections in another 3 or 4 months, again, our 5th set of elections. But I don't think that it was Netanyahu's strategy, because Netanyahu is not, despite his image, is actually rather risk averse and is not usually one who uses force lightly. But what he is a master at exploiting circumstances. So this began to develop, and then Hamas, we'll discuss later, sort of played into his hands by suddenly transforming the Jerusalem issue into a Hamas-Israel issue, and then basically convinced one of the key partners, convinced one of the key right-wing anti-Netanyahu partners that he could not join a government, a left-wing government in a time of national crisis. So basically defanged and removed him. and led to and the situation developed in such a way that it would be almost impossible in the current state of relations between Arabs and Jews within Israel for a government that depended for its majority on Arab parties to survive. So basically, while I don't think Netanyahu planned this, I think Netanyahu used it very well to basically dismantle the most significant possibility that there has been up until now that he would be removed from office. In fact, the day or 2 days before, it was almost clear that within a day or two, the new government would be announced. Right? And then that new government was not announced. And just one other odd thing, the day after all of this happened, his trial continued in Jerusalem District Court. Because while this is all going on, Netanyahu was still being on trial for fraud and abuse of office. And on the Palestinian side, we also have sort of political developments that lead up to the explosive nature of this, which is you have a government headed by Abu Mazen, by Mahmoud Abbas, which was elected for one term in 2006, which is a very long one term. But Hamas won those elections to the Legislative Assembly. But in the end, the results of that elections were canceled. And part of the results of those elections being canceled was the splitting of the Palestinian Authority to two de facto separate entities, right? East Palestine under Fatah and Abu Mazen, and West Palestine in Gaza under Hamas. And 3 or 4 days before this all broke out, Abu Mazen canceled the elections. He postponed them, but he postponed them without saying when they were going to be. And he blamed the fact that Israel was causing difficulties to inhabitants of East Jerusalem to vote in the elections. But in fact, the reason why I canceled elections was it was clear that if the elections were held, Fatah would lose. And Fatah would lose, by the way, for the same reason they lost in 2006, which is there were 3 or 4 different factions which were going to run theoretically under the Fatah banner. Hamas which has much more unity and much more discipline, would win those elections, and therefore the election was canceled. And so Hamas actually on May 10th, the night between May 10th and May 11th, basically seized the political high ground, right? The elections have been canceled. There was tremendous anger with Israel over both within Israel, in Jerusalem, in the West Bank, and in the Arab world about how Jerusalem was handling events how Israel was handling events in Jerusalem. And that night, Hamas fired rockets at Jerusalem and basically seized the political high ground. It was obviously a move to gain political credibility to say Abu Mazen is powerless, but we are able to defend Jerusalem. We are able to defend Al-Aqsa. And this move, by the way, also to kind of saved Israel, right? Because from it being a crisis which was based around Sheikh Jarrah and among Israelis' sort of ham-handedness in handling issues in Jerusalem, including on the Temple Mount, it suddenly turned into something else, another round of the ongoing conflict between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. And of course, Hamas, by firing first, also then on the one hand, perhaps gained what it thought would be a moral step supporting the Arab world, but in fact shifted the narrative to the narrative of Gaza being in a war that Hamas started. And it's also, by the way, and maybe I could address this later, somebody also helped the Abraham Accord countries, which were in an extremely difficult position just before that, because what were they going to do? Their population is very unhappy about the Israeli actions in Al-Aqsa, but on the other hand, the governments did not want to take any steps which would harm their newly found relations with Israel. And of course, once it shifted over to Hamas, it changed the dialectic entirely. So I think the most worrisome issue, as I pointed out, for me and for most of us in Israel, are the developments inside Israel, because almost immediately after the exchange began between Hamas and Israel, and Hamas until now has fired over 3,000 rockets into Israel, you began to see in some of the mixed cities in Israel, but also in some of the areas where there is a majority Arab population, you began to see the beginning of sectarian violence. And the first stage, Arab citizens of Israel attacking Jewish citizens of Israel, and then in a reaction, Jewish citizens of Israel attacking Arab citizens of Israel as well. This started in two of the mixed cities, especially in Lod, which is a city which is known in Israel as suffering from a very high level of criminality and lawlessness. There's a problem of rule of law there. The Arab community has been pointing this out to the government for many years. Abbas ran on this. One of the reasons Mansour Abbas was willing to join the government was to help deal with the problem of lawlessness and criminality in the Arab villages. So you have this outbreak, which is continuing, right? It had a first day or two, which were extremely bad. Both an Arab citizen of Israel and a Jewish citizen of Israel were killed in the first 2 days. But now, basically, to this moment, large parts of the country are basically no-go zones, either for Jewish inhabitants or for Arab inhabitants, and a development which we really haven't seen for over 20 years. 20 years ago, we saw it, not on this level. So it's actually something that's almost new in Israel since its establishment. There are a lot of issues there. We can address them afterwards. And I will just make one observation before I stop and we take questions, Aaron, which is one of the issues that has come up a lot, certainly in the American narrative, in the American discussions of this, is they say, well, look, the Abraham Accords were meant to show the Palestinian issue isn't important anymore, and here the Palestinian issue has reasserted itself, and we need new diplomatic efforts in order to solve the Palestinian issue. And I'll just say that not everybody, certainly not me and not most of the people in Israel, ever thought that the Palestinian issue was gone, right? There may have been those, certainly those at the highest political level, who acted like it was gone. But we all knew that this issue was the major issue that faces, the major strategic, or one of the two major strategic issues that faces Israel, and was never going to be gone. What was true is that it has appeared almost impervious to a diplomatic solution for the past 20 years. Right? In 2000, it reached sort of a high point, and it didn't succeed. And since then, both because of the weakness of Abu Mazen, because of the split between the two parts of Palestine, with one of them being under Hamas, but also because of the rights strengthening in Israel, there wasn't really a serious chance for a diplomatic solution that has been in place for the past 20 years. And part of the problem is, while I think a lot of people would like to think that now that this issue has come back onto the agenda, it needs to be solved, I don't think that anything in sort of the root conditions has changed. In other words, while it's really important to solve this issue, and while it would be great if there was a solution, it's not at all clear that at this point there actually is one. And that's sort of one of the pessimistic things, Aaron, that I think I'll end off on there, and then we'll open it up to questions.
Well, thank you for that. And just want to remind everybody, we have 3 already in the Q&A box. You can always add more. We can take more. And with that, I wanted to first raise a question brought up by Bungie Churchill. And I want to combine it with something that I think maybe that you haven't yet addressed, but I know you have keen insights on, which is, what are the potential implications if Hezbollah shoots rockets into the north of Israel, which I believe we've seen on a very small scale this morning, East Coast time, probably afternoon for you all. But you've also seen, coupled with this, news today of, I believe, the 4th call between Netanyahu and Biden, where you had the most sort of forthright and strident language coming from the Biden administration, calling for a significant de-escalation, if not today, within the very short time frame. Can you perhaps link those two together, the potential of more rocket fire from the north and the potential to begin to wind this down on a de-escalation campaign?
So about fire from the north, I think there's a factual issue here and there's an analytical issue, which are really important. Factual issue is in 2014 as well, Ahmed Jibril's organization fired rockets from Lebanon into Israel. The idea being that Ahmed Jibril's organization is one of the radical Palestinian splinter groups. The idea being that it would draw Israel to retaliate into Lebanon and therefore draw Hezbollah in on the side of Hamas. And from what we've seen up to now, all of the rockets that have been fired into Israel from Lebanon, it's happened 3 times already, have been apparently fired by either Palestinian or jihadi factions who are apparently trying exactly that. In other words, to draw Israel into responding towards Lebanon and therefore widening the war from being a war that is concentrated between Gaza and Israel. I would say that Hezbollah plays a very significant role in the maybe links into the second issue that you asked, into the reason why this conflict is not ending so quickly. And the answer is that the asymmetric level of the conflict will always make Hamas the winner in the narrative, right? Because unfortunately, the way it works is while they're firing many, many rockets into Israel and they're firing it only at civilian targets, they are killing many fewer Israelis than Israel is killing Palestinians. Now, part of the problem here is that there's a perception in the Israeli national security establishment, and I think a correct perception, that Hezbollah is watching how we are managing and how we plan to end this crisis, right? And and the argument would say that if we seem to be pressured, or we seem to be worried, or we seem to be not determined enough to see it through, whatever see it through means, and we'll get to that in a minute, then that could encourage Hezbollah next time. In other words, in the end, the major enemy and the more dangerous enemy in terms of rockets and missiles is, of course, Hezbollah. But Hezbollah has been deterred for 15 years from firing rockets and missiles at Israel. And the question is, how do you handle the equation with Hamas in a way that it doesn't then harm the deterrence that you have built up for 15 years with Hamas? So I think that's part of the issue, as you say that the Americans are calling for Israel to end. I think there are 2 main reasons why Israel is not calling to end. First of all, there's always, all militaries have this, right, Aaron? I need 1 more day and then I'll do what I need to do. In other words, you know, the Israeli military has been crowing about how well it's doing in harming the Hamas infrastructure and Hamas military infrastructure, Hamas leadership. And I think there's always this issue that if you just give us a little bit more time, you know, another day, another half a day, we'll be able to solve it. Part of that, by the way, is the feeling in Israel that, for instance, 2006 in the Lebanon war, Israel went to a ceasefire too quickly. And that was a lesson that was learned from the military. But I think the other issue is one that we discussed before. I think it is hard to make political decisions right now in the country. I think the person who is running, the chief of staff is basically running the operation. The person who's basically handling it and to a large extent handling internal security is the defense minister, Benny Gantz, who is the senior coalition partner of Netanyahu, but is at this point his sworn enemy. So you have this very strange sort of 2-headed government running things. And I think that that's part of perhaps, you know, it's always a problem in Israel for the civilian authority to sort of reach a decision and not, once they reach a decision, they impose it on the military easily. There is no problem with civil military relations in Israel. But no one wants to because they don't want to be perceived as being the one who prevented the army from being victorious. So I think that within the next 24 hours, my estimate is within the next 24 hours or even less, it's going to end. But I think one of the reasons it's been so protracted is because of this problem in terms of the political level actually making a decision.
There's something I wanted to key off, and it's a variation of one of the questions we got in the chat, which is, you know, there's a divergence, I think, in the asymmetry of how this war will ultimately come to an end, is that no matter how well the Israeli Air Force does in achieving the goals that it sets for itself, it will be perceived that because the rocket fire was not stopped, is that Hamas will ultimately be the victor. And one of the things that people will point to in that metric is the level of destruction of infrastructure in Gaza, right? And here on the American left, what we are seeing is a more sort of divided Democratic Party in its support for Israel, just culminating this morning in pushing for either a block or a suspension out of the House Foreign Affairs Committee on the sale of precision-guided munitions to the Israelis. So,
yeah,
how is this being perceived in Israel itself amongst Israelis? Because Americans, we talk amongst ourselves. So that's
one of the problems is that because of the asymmetric nature of the wars that Israel has been fighting for the past 30 years, there is always an asymmetry of results. I don't want to get too much into this part, but I'll just say people talk about disproportionality. So the question isn't whether the result is disproportionate. But for instance, if we didn't have Iron Dome, we would have hundreds of, we already have hundreds of casualties in terms of wounded, but we would perhaps have hundreds of fatalities, right? So there is a fundamental asymmetry in the capabilities of the two sides. And I think that one of the problems that we've always had is that in large parts of the Western world, especially those parts who have not suffered directly from the actions of terror and from violence, is there seems to be an illegitimacy of any use of force by a government against a smaller adversary. And I say, you know, it used to be way back when in 1948, we were David and our enemies were Goliath. And now, of course, that's been switched. And I think there's an understanding in Israel that international support is always going to be between the one who is perceived as the underdog. For the one who's perceived the underdog. And the fact that we are fighting against an enemy in Gaza who is not democratic, right, who doesn't have an open society, who we can't see, certainly not now, what the different currents are, and we can't really see whether the actions that are being carried out in their name are in fact in their name. I think that we're always going to be in a bit of a, not a bit of a disadvantage, in a disadvantage. It's been that true for all of the wars that Israel has been involved in the past, 40 years. And it's something that we learn to live with. In other words, I think that we don't disregard it, right? We try to explain ourselves, and we certainly try to minimize the number of civilian casualties on the other side. But in the end, it's going to happen. Like it happens, by the way, unfortunately, to any other highly industrialized military that's fighting an insurgency. There tends to be a disproportion on the other side between the number of civilian casualties or uninvolved casualties and the number of fighters. And one of the other issues is that it's going to take a long time, if ever, till we find out what the exact numbers are. It's clear to me that, unfortunately, there are many civilian casualties on the other side. And thankfully, because of Iron Dome, we have many fewer on our side. But it's a fundamental disproportion in the way it looks that I don't think there's a whole lot that Israel could do to solve. And by the way, that answers, there was a question here of how could Israel do a better job of explaining itself? Undoubtedly, we could do a better job of explaining ourselves, but it won't really help, because in the end, we're explaining something that people, certainly people in the West, are hardwired to sort of feel more for the underdog than for the larger and better equipped and stronger party in an asymmetric conflict.
Is the
that
operation,
maybe answer your question a little bit, Aaron?
It does. Is the operation like popular in Israel itself, or is there skepticism and questions about how this is all unfolding, given the political fractures you talked about earlier?
I'm going to split my answer into, I don't know, we'll see how many, 4, 5, 6 parts, right? The action against Hamas is popular. By the way, to the extent that there is criticism of it, there's criticism on 2 things. First of all, despite the image that some have, most Israelis don't sleep well at night knowing that there are being innocent people, civilian people killed on the other side, right? It is an unfortunate product of war, but it's something that we would like to end. On the other hand, there are many, many people in Israel who are saying, and certainly very concentrated among the supporters of Netanyahu's coalition and also of the right-wing parties that are against Netanyahu, but also right-wing, which is, because we keep on holding back, we do this every few years, right? In other words, we have these exchanges every few years. We had one in 2014, but we've had rockets fired since 2014. Before 2014, we had 2012, we had 2009, we had 2006. In other words, the feeling is that the military solution that is being used is not effective. Now, the people who feel that it's not as effective as it could be, for the vast majority, don't think we should be doing something significantly else, right? There are those who think we should be conquering Gaza. I think there's very little appetite for that. And I think that the Israeli civilian population, considering how many rockets are flying and considering that they went through this several years ago, is fairly resilient. But there's criticism. There is a large element that, as I said, I don't agree with that thinks that this is a war that is either being fought or fought the way it's being fought or being extended for political reasons. The first casualty of this war was the possibility that there would be a successful anti-Netanyahu coalition government. And a lot of people get past that. In other words, they say there must be some sort of extremely nefarious master plan here. So that I'm putting aside. There is certainly a lot of criticism of how the events in Jerusalem were handled. There is certainly a lot of criticism, or not as much, a lot of soul searching, how we got to the situation where we have open violence within Israel between the Arab and the Israeli populations, right? And that really splits on political lines, right? Some people, we've been too good to the Arabs. Some people, we haven't been good enough to Arabs. But everybody is both surprised and quite concerned. And you literally see it lining up on both sides. So I think there's, and I think that overall, there's a feeling that certainly the issues of Jerusalem could have been handled better. Now, I'm going to take you to something that's totally unconnected, but in Israel, it's very closely connected. 2 weeks ago, we had this Meron tragedy where 45 people were killed at a holy site after they were trampled. And there again, it turns out that the police hadn't planned correctly, hadn't handled it correctly, that no one from the government had actually gone over the plans, that no one was willing to make the decision of there are too many, you only can let a certain number of people in. So there's a lot of criticism of the dysfunctionality of this government. What that means, does that mean anything regarding next elections? I don't know.
This brings a question that was raised about some of the domestic issues, perhaps as one of these multitudes of precipitating events that you laid out in your presentation. And it's more, I guess, a legal question, but I'm curious if you have thoughts. I'm just going to read it, which is, one of our participants has been asked if the courts honor the fact that the land belonged to the Jewish owners until they were forced to flee and abandon the property and now want it back. And does that not then raise that question, why do the Jewish leaders not honor this for homes where Arabs were fled in 1948 and want their homes back? This is really that sticky issue, right? So if perhaps you can comment on that.
I don't want to comment too much on this.
I don't blame you, but it's a good question.
Really, the issue, no. So I'll try to answer something. When I say that there are a lot of people who say, oh, we need a diplomatic solution and the Americans need to make a peace initiative. One of the problems is we know now, because of how much progress was done between 1994 and 2001. And by the way, Prime Minister Olmert in 2007 made another suggestion, which in the end was turned down by the Palestinian side. And of course, then he was tried, so it never continued. We pretty much know where the red lines are. And we know that there are three issues which it's going to be extremely hard to ever bridge, right? Trump and Kushner tried to bridge it in a totally different way, but in the end, these issues come out. One is the issue of Jerusalem, right? Which is each side feels that the issue of Jerusalem is not really up for debate. In other words, each one wants 100%. Now, there have been suggestions by various Israeli prime ministers and various Israeli negotiators in the past of how we could reach a different division of Jerusalem, right? There was suggestion that a Palestinian capital would be in Jerusalem, but not necessarily all of Jerusalem. But in the end, the Jerusalem issue, both certainly on the side of Hamas, but on the side of a plurality, I don't know if a majority of Palestinians, both within the territories and outside, and a plurality, if not a majority, of Israelis, of Israeli Jews, don't see that there's an issue there that can be settled. There is not going to be compromise. The other issue, which is extremely difficult, is the right of return, which is what this question brings you into, right? The Palestinians insist on Israel recognize, at least theoretically, the right of return of Palestinian refugees to their homes. And Israel, in the past, by the way, has agreed to allow 10,000, and once even suggested 50,000, but the rest not. So, and of course, the right of return on the Palestinian side is considered, at least the recognition of a theoretical, the fundamental right of return is the issue on which the peace talks broke down in 2000. Right? They broke down on the right of return and on Jerusalem, same two issues. 2006, 2007 broke down right of return in Jerusalem. So these are where we know are the real bedrock problems. And part of what happened in the Oslo process, and part of perhaps the mistake of the Oslo process, I'm not sure that it was a mistake, but I do understand the argument that we made, was that they said we'll settle the easy problems in the beginning and the hard problems will solve themselves towards the end. And in the end, what we see is that the hard problems keep on coming back. So yes, there is certainly a dichotomy here in between saying that Israeli properties that belonged to Jews before 1948 that Israelis who are reclaiming them does immediately raise a question of why it's not why that doesn't work both ways. And the quick answer, not necessarily a very good answer, is that's the way Israeli law is. Right? Israeli law says that property that belonged to Jews before 1948, if they can prove ownership, they can retain it, and does not permit people who left Israel in 1948 to return and give claims. As I said, when this case was being adjudicated in courts, the fact that no one at the political level seems to have realized quite how explosive it was is sort of one of those things which I said, which sort of makes you wonder how well this government has been functioning.
Well, this brings us sort of full circle here, and one of them, I'm gonna bring together some questions from the audience. And by the way, if you have any final questions here, now is the time, because we have about 10 minutes left. So please flood us so I can give Josh the lightning round, which is good.
Aaron, I just see that Mark Krasna asked 2 questions.
That's right.
And since he's my brother, so
I figured he was related.
If you could put those into the mix, that would be good. That's
what I'm asking right now. I'm asking your brother's questions, which he can always send you a text, but he's choosing to do it here over Zoom. I'm going to ask the question, which is, we're looking beyond the ceasefire. This is what your brother is asking. Are there any real potential partners for peace with the Israelis in Gaza? And is there anything that Zahal should do before a ceasefire, or is this solely a political issue? And I want to ask one more slight tweak to that, just because I'm curious, which is, I have heard from certain Israeli security thinkers is that the Gaza problem is one that they don't have a good answer for, because the withdrawal from 2006 has essentially left a besieged enclave that needs to be addressed. So it's a variation on the potential partners for peace in Gaza. But please answer your brother's question.
So again, Aaron and Raleigh, knowing what FPRI's motto is. So I'm going to take us back a little bit in history. Again, not 70 years, just a little bit. I think that what makes the issue in Gaza particularly insoluble is things that happened in 2005 and 2007. 2005, Israel withdrew entirely from Gaza. Sometimes I see people now talking about occupied Gaza, and I say, well, you could say besieged enclave, as you said, which I can't argue with. Occupied it is not, right? There are no Israelis in Gaza. And in 2007, after the 2006 elections, in which the Palestinian Authority, with Israeli connivance, did not allow I should say, Fatah and Hamas formed a government, but that government was never effective. In 2007, Hamas seized control of the Gaza Strip, and in fact led to this de facto partition of Palestine. And the issue that you have then is there might well be people in Gaza who we could negotiate with. The problem is that at the moment, Gaza is a Hamas dictatorship, right? In other words, you have an unelected government there, which keeps itself in power by providing services to the population and by having an extremely effective security apparatus, which keeps it in power. In other words, there have been no elections in Gaza since 2006, in the same way there haven't been elections. So, and the leadership there right now is the political leadership of Gaza is almost identical to the military and political leadership of Hamas, which is a terrorist organization that is sworn to destroy Israel. So while I think that we have negotiated indirectly with Hamas over the years, we've even negotiated with them directly to release prisoners in the past. In other words, Hamas can be engaged. Hamas is not a totally irrational actor. The fact that Hamas controls territory and is acting as a government makes it have interests like a government, and therefore it can be rewarded or punished as states do between each other. However, it's quite difficult because in the end, I think that there would not be a majority. There would certainly never be consensus, but there wouldn't even be a small majority in Israel which would agree to direct negotiations between Israel and Hamas. By the way, I'm not at all sure Hamas would be interested in that in the first place. And as long as Hamas has the hold over Gaza that they do, then there is really no one else in Gaza we could be engaging. So it's a bit of a problem.
So I'm going to ask another question. Maybe I'll ask two together. One is from Alan Luxembourg, which I know you know Alan, which is shortly before the unrest, Human Rights Watch issued a report describing Israel as an apartheid state, in part because after 54 years, occupation is no longer temporary. The Israeli organization B'Tselem also described Israel as an apartheid state. How do you see the significance of reports like these? And the second one is, given that rocket fire has become sort of semi-regular from Gaza and sometimes from southern Lebanon, was the Israeli security establishment caught off guard by the number of rockets and sophistication of rockets? And those are probably our last two questions. So,
right. So
Josh,
first of all, I'll just correct you a bit. The number of rockets that have been fired from Lebanon since 2006 is less than rockets that have been fired in 1 hour from Gaza this time. I don't think it's reached 20 since 2006. It might have, but certainly hasn't reached 50. In other words, that border is fairly quiet, certainly in terms of rockets crossing the border, apparently because of deterrence that we were able to achieve with Hezbollah. And also because Hezbollah in the end is not the sole power center in Lebanon. There is a Lebanese government which Hezbollah is part of, but which Hezbollah can't do everything that they want in Lebanon, unlike in Hamas. So about B'Tselem and about the apartheid state, so I don't agree that Israel is an apartheid state. I do think that those reports harm Israel's image. They enforce the narrative. I've seen, for instance, a lot since the beginning of this particular round of conflict. I've seen a lot of tweets and a lot of other things saying that the occupation isn't the problem, right? The problem is the colonialism of the establishment of the state of Israel itself, right? So I think there are many Israelis who would agree that remaining in West Bank and Gaza is is something that harms Israeli democracy and harms Israeli society, though they will then ask, okay, but then who are we handing it over to? Because what goes on in Gaza now, Aaron, this returns to the earlier question, what's going on from Gaza now very much strengthens those people who say that Israel needs to remain in the West Bank. Because they say, well, we pulled out of Gaza and see what's happening now. I think, as I said, Israel is facing a campaign of delegitimization. I think that there is use of certain terms like apartheid, like colonialism, which have an emotive factor. I don't think Israel's an apartheid state. By the way, I think a lot of my friends who are of South African origin and lived in an apartheid state don't think they live in one here. But you know, I think that yes, these things do harm Israel. They harm Israel in terms of the people who don't support Israel. The people who never support Israel are not going to support Israel now. The people who always supported Israel will probably continue to support Israel. There is a large part, certainly in the in all countries, but especially in the United States, which wasn't this way or that way. And I think that is something that Israel has to really worry about in terms of the way that we are being perceived, certainly among the younger generation in the United States. But I'll add to that and say I'm not sure that in the current political situation, both within Israel, but also on the Palestinian side, that this is something that we'll be able to solve very soon.
Well, Josh, you have about a minute left. Is there any last words you wanted to say before I close this out?
So just, you know what, I think so. I don't know, looking forward, right? So I think that the country, that we are going to have a ceasefire sooner rather than later. I think the ceasefire is being promoted by countries who are involved, who have been already reached a peace treaty with Israel, Jordan, Egypt, and by one actor, Qatar, who has played usually a quite positive role from Israeli perspective in Gaza, even though they don't have relations with Israel. But I think that what's going on now inside Israel and the split, or let's say the opening of the split, or the exposure of the split between Israel's Jewish majority and Arab Muslim minority, I think is the more worrisome for me looking forward, right? Because Israel, whether Israel is an apartheid state, I don't think it is over the Green Line. Within the Green Line, Israel is a Western democracy, where, as I said, where Arab Israelis last week, 2 weeks ago, had reached almost, right, the pinnacle of their political engagement, and of the with the right wing finally agreeing to bring Arabs into their coalition, which then meant that the left wing could bring Arabs into their coalition because now it had been legitimized. And I don't know where we're going to be when the dust settles on this. I think that there may well have been lasting damage to the relationship between Jews and Arabs within Israel, and that's what I think is more worrisome to me.
Well, on that positive note, on that happy note, I want to thank you, Josh, for taking the time to speak to us. That was quite a tour de force, as it always is. And as I want to reiterate that I do hope that you know, given vaccination rates in Israel and vaccination rates in the United States, is that we can soon host you in the US and that you can begin to travel. For those who want to engage more on this issue or with FPRI in general, head on over to fpri.org, where we have all of our articles, all of our analyses, podcasts, anything you can think of published on our website. And if you want to get even more involved, I encourage you to click on the support button, because one of the major ways that we fund ourselves is through people like you donating or becoming members. So with that, I want to wish everybody a good day, good evening in your case, Josh, and have a good rest of the day. Thank you very much.